So I feel like our OneBody services could be used as some type of social experiment on adaptability. Because even though we all worship in this space, we don't typically do it together. We do it at separate times. And even though a lot of the elements are the same, we approach them very differently. So maybe, Andy crooning and playing his guitar is a little informal for your worship style. Or maybe things like hymns and the organ and things like that are too stuffy for your worship style. But most importantly, more than likely, somebody this morning that you don't know is sitting in your pew turf. You know how churches do that? Everybody has their own area that they always sit in. So I feel as though OneBody Services gives us this opportunity to lean into discomfort and to try something different that we wouldn't otherwise. So why are you here? Why did you change up your Sunday morning routine to come here early or come here late to be here with us? Why is it that you're leaning into discomfort this morning instead of running from it? I hope and pray that you're here because you recognize that sometimes discomfort, is the price that we pay for growth and vision and community. And I hope that you recognize that with church, you often get out what you put in, so the more you show up and plug in, the more you benefit from community. Or maybe you're here today because you are empty. Like Tom said, it's been a week in our faith community on lots of different levels. So maybe you carried your grief in here with you like a weight. And so maybe being a little uncomfortable doesn't really bother you much because grief is weighing you down. So I hope that whatever your comfort level or whatever you're carrying with you won't hold you back from leaning into curiosity and creativity and hope this morning. Would you pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations on all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So some of you might be curious as to what I'm doing up here in the pulpit. You might think it's odd for me to be up here when I'm not wearing a robe and a stole. Tom offered me one, but I declined. It's just not my style. And I don't have an REV at the beginning of my name. So the Koinonia service is used to seeing me up front quite a bit, but many of you mostly see me at my desk, juggling about 10 things at once, or running around with a to-do list as long as my arm. So those of you who have gotten to know me, though, have found out that I'm far from the typical church secretary. And there's a lot to my story and about my journey that has brought me to you standing here today, and I want to share a little bit of that story with you. So hermeneutics, or the study and art of rightly interpreting the Bible, is something I've been taught since I was really young, because I was brought up in the conservative evangelical faith tradition that highly values these things, and especially highly values teaching them to children. So I was taught all of the things that I needed to know from the Bible to be a good, chaste Christian woman. You can imagine how well that worked out. But I never quite fit in. I asked too many questions, especially for women, and I went a little too far off the beaten path for everybody's comfort. But I tried really, really hard to fit in. And those of you who know me, again, will guess how well that worked out for me. But I played the part for a long time because I felt called to ministry. But being excluded from the pulpit, because in the faith tradition, women cannot be pastors, I decided to do the next best thing. I became an evangelical missionary. Do you have that slide? This is photo evidence that this happened. Yeah. So I was an evangelical missionary. I started when I was really young, when I was 13. But even before then, I had learned that if I learned enough and worked enough, then nobody would notice that I didn't fit in. They wouldn't notice that I didn't actually believe what I was being taught, or that I was teaching what they had given to me a little bit differently than they had given it to me, or that I couldn't reconcile what my heart and my body and my soul knew about God and what my brain was being filled with about God. So I buried who I genuinely, authentically was. The real me wasn't safe in that space. The real me wasn't right in that space. Because the real me would end up being lonely and unhappy because I was outside of what they felt God's will and plan for my life was. I was a challenger and a pot stirrer, and I held the truest parts of myself so closely that I'm still discovering long-buried truths within myself. But I taught children the Bible. I went through rigorous leadership training. I trained pastors and Sunday school teachers and missionaries and lay people how to build effective children's ministry outreach. And so I went to Bible college, and I did all of these things, but I missed the deepest truths about God and about myself. So all this to say, I could stand here today and give you all kinds of information about this text on wilderness. I could give you well-crafted, theologically sound exegesis about the cultural and historical significance of the parting of the Red Sea, and about how the book of Exodus, along with the rest of the Pentateuch, was not written by Moses, but was oral tradition compiled by as many as 3 authors in the post-exilic Israel. I could tell you all of that and explain it to you, but I'm not going to do that today. You're welcome. I'd make it somewhat entertaining. Because really the most important question that I can ask myself as I interpret this text about starting into wilderness and experiencing the greatness of God, is what has wilderness meant to me? And what does wilderness mean to you personally, and to us corporately as we set out on this journey? So I thought this week about the children of Israel and how they felt in that moment after the Red Sea. And I tried to place myself in their shoes and draw parallels to my own life journey. These people were quite a ragamuffin group. These were former slaves. They had been told what to eat, what to wear, how to work, when to sit down, when to stand up, and how to live their entire lives. And their bodies were used and abused at the pleasure of their oppressors, and now they stood on the precipice of freedom. They had packed up and left lives and identities that they had once knew with the promise and hope for something better, the Promised Land. A land flowing with milk and honey. And there they were, having been pursued by the Egyptians, fearing for their lives at the hands of their oppressors again, but God prevailed. And in the end, they stood blinking in the sun, looking at wide open space, and were in awe of God's mercy. But also wondering, what now? But how? I want to tell you about a time that I felt like that. I mentioned that I was an evangelical missionary, and that was a career path that I set out on pretty early. I started as a volunteer when I was 13, teaching Bible clubs. By the time I was 21, I was working in their international offices as a staff member, overseeing the ministry of 300 staff members and 700 volunteers nationwide. My job was communications, so I learned how to maintain websites, use social media and email marketing, do graphic design, and all of the business functions of ministry there. But I was also, during that time, I was in love. And the problem was that I was in love with a woman who was part of the missionary training program that I was a part of. Since loving her and loving one another was sinful in the eyes of the ministry leadership, there was quite a stir when our relationship came to light. And the end result was that after 16 years of ministry, Bible college, leadership training, and a relocation to Missouri, I was jobless, homeless, and without the woman that I loved. Through many turns of events and plenty of therapy, I got my job back. I endured a few more years of shame and hiding and pain. I saw the woman that I loved once after all of this happened and haven't really heard from her since. I spent a lot of time in oppression during my early life, but this was the worst that I had ever been through. Because my oppressors were watching my every move, gossip followed me wherever I went. It even resulted in false accusations and weekly meetings with an on-staff therapist who just knew if I would read my Bible enough and pray enough, I would be straight. So at the end of all of this, in 2008, the economy took a hit, and so did every ministry and every nonprofit in the U.S., and I lost my job due to funding cuts. So while it stung to leave after fighting so hard to stay, I felt free, but I stood blinking in the sun, wondering what now, but how? Because the career path that I had been on for 16 years now had kind of come to a really abrupt end. So the subsequent years have been my wilderness. And the journey has been anything but straightforward. It's been this job and that job, a change in careers, moving back home, getting married, moving away, becoming a mom, coming home, coming out, divorce, finding love again, healing, pain, joy, confusion, awe, and most of all, wilderness has been grief for me. And I'm standing here today, and I'm really feeling the children of Israel and the place that they were in, and their wanderings in the wilderness, their doubt, their complaining, and most of all, their grieving process. Because before they could go to the promised land and take hold of that, they had to leave the remnants of their identities as Hebrew slaves. And it took them 40 years to shake that off. And most of them died without ever seeing the promised land. But they still believed. And the journey from Egypt to Canaan isn't a 40-year-long journey. They could have gotten there much quicker. But never forget that God is way more interested in our journey than in our arrival at the destination. So do you think maybe the children of Israel looked back once they got to the promised land and said, what have we been doing? Sometimes I kind of feel like that about my own wilderness journey. But as I'm emerging from wilderness, I see the transformational power that wilderness had over me. One thing that I know about God in my journey is that God never promised that my journey would be easy or fast. God never promised that my journey wouldn't hurt me. God never promised that heartache wouldn't be a companion on my journey. But God does promise to be with me on my journey through wilderness, and that the wilderness will be transformative. And I would even venture to say that God with us in wilderness is what makes it transformative. That God's presence with us in wilderness is what makes that powerful. So we are corporately about to be transformed by wilderness. In the coming weeks, you're going to be hearing about wilderness wanderings. You're going to hear about what our faith tradition has to say about wilderness. And you're going to be given space to consider your own wilderness wanderings. Because we are not unlike the children of Israel on the other side of the Red Sea. We've seen the amazing things that God has done through our church. We are in the midst of major identity change like the children of Israel were. Who we are as a church has gone through this huge evolution, especially in the last 2 decades. We have a vision toward what the promised land could look like for our church. What now? But how? So as you start to consider the implications of this transformative wilderness, I want you to consider 3 things about wilderness, and especially corporate wilderness as we move into it. The first thing is that love will get us through. Not a plan, not well-executed to-do lists. Love will get us through. Wilderness can seem daunting, mostly because there's just so much we don't know. That means that there's going to be a lot of fear. And in the stories about the children of Israel in the wilderness, you're going to hear a lot about their doubt and complaining and how they messed up. But remember, at the foundation of those things is fear. Fear that there's not enough, fear that they're not going to ever make it, fear that this was a bad plan just to begin with. But notice how the love of God and the love of one another sees the children of Israel through the wilderness journey. Look around this room and look at someone that you don't know from another service. You need their love to see you through this wilderness. We need one another in the wilderness. Koinonia wasn't even here a few years ago, and look at it now. Last Sunday was Epiphany Sunday. Each child in the Koinonia faith community got a personalized gift from an artist, and when we sat down and actually made a list, there's like 30 kids. That's growth, and that's amazing, and it's exciting, and it's new, and it's different. But for Koinonia to continue to see growth, we need 10 a.m. service to ground us. in the tradition that helped form our identities. We need the loving faithfulness of people like the Mumfords and the Goddards and the Harmons and Pearl Walden and Delight Buddhists and so many other people. Those of us who are new members to this church benefit from the blood, sweat, tears, energy, effort, and love from people we sometimes have never even met. And if there's any way that we can honor the love and work of people like Glenn Schultz and Wes Kimball and Alan Harmon and John Lauer, is to love one another and to stick together in this. So we've done this revision process, and we're gauging our identity as a church and listening for God's direction, but we don't really know what the promised land looks like or where it is or even how to get there. Anybody feel a little afraid about that? But did you catch what Moses says to the children of Israel over and over and over again? Do not be afraid. Less fear, more love. And as we begin this transformative journey together and people to start to get afraid, remember to always lean toward love, because fear will oppress you, but love will transform you. And transformational love shared between those on this journey will sustain you. The second thing to remember is that wilderness involves grief. The journey through the wilderness was needed for the children of Israel so they could become the people they needed to be to inhabit the promised land, and that involved a ton of grief. Because to take hold of what was ahead of them, they had to let go of a lot while they were redefining what was most important to them. They went through a lot of grief to get to the promised land. Most of those who set out on the journey didn't even make it there, but their children inherited benefits from their grief and their work and their love. So in this wilderness journey, you will likely lose something. And whatever that is, it deserves to be grieved. But there is always hope. Even if it is faint, even if it is engulfed in pain, that there is hope in the promised land. And the last thing is that the promised land lies ahead of us, not behind us. Membership in the United Church of Christ peaked in the 1950s and has declined ever since. So a decline in church membership is not anything new. This has been happening. And there are so many factors that have contributed to this decline. Some may think that we have to go backwards to the glory days, whatever those were, and that's the promised land. So that if we can bring back all of those things that defined the church then, we'd be all set. The children of Israel said similar things. They longed for what they had in Egypt. They knew that they would have food and shelter and survival, but because their oppressors would make sure that they had it. But God had more. God had something else in mind, and God didn't want them to be satisfied and comfortable and at ease. The same is true for us. We can't control culture. We can't control time. And the more we fight change, the more closed off we become to what God has in store for us. This is not to say that change and new things should overshadow the reality of grief, of losing things, because grief still hurts. But we cannot let our grief over what was hold us back from what could be. So the church as we know it today will be totally different in 10 years. So we are in this uncomfortable place of letting go of what was to make way for what is coming. And God will help us make that way. Because the children of Israel, as they went through the wilderness, had the presence of God with them, and the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke on Mount Sinai, and the parting of the Red Sea, and making sure that they had food, and making sure that their enemies were, that they holding back their enemies. God was with them and present with them. And God will be present with us as we are here, like the children of Israel, on the precipice of change. So, what now? How are we going to do this? Wilderness, that's what. And one step at a time, that's how. So whether it's personal wilderness or corporate wilderness, it's all about the journey, not about the destination. Love will see us through this. There will be grief, but the best is yet to come.